Welcome to Spooky History. In this episode we're heading out to the high seas to hear the lesser-known cursed adventures of the Mary Celeste. We've all heard the story. About 1 PM on Wednesday, December the 4th, 1872, land time, Captain Morehouse of the DEWA came on deck and the helmsman reported a vessel about 6 miles away heading unsteadily towards them. Something was wrong. As the vessel drew close, he saw that nobody was on deck, and when no reply followed his signals, 2 crew members were sent to investigate. The only sign of the crew were their possessions and the imprint of a sleeping child in a wet mattress. The ship was still seaworthy, the lifeboat was missing, and the ship's log's final entry, dated at 8 AM on November 25th, 9 days earlier, recorded the Mary Celeste's position over 300 miles away. None of the 10 crew members were ever heard from again. As creepy and weird as all that sounds, finding a ghost ship isn't actually that uncommon. After all, it's just an old mariner's term for any vessel found sailing without her crew, and there are many things that can cause an evacuation, from natural disasters, extreme weather, human error, crime, to drastic equipment malfunction. By definition, a successful evacuation shouldn't leave anyone behind to explain it, or give you time to write out a handy manuscript detailing what happened to you just in case your belongings turn out to have a more active social life than you do in the near future. In the 19th century, dozens of ghost ships were found every year, and they still are. In fact, over 25 named vessels have been found abandoned since 2000 alone, with uncorroborated reports of many more before and since that date. The Oval Office desk used by the President of the United States of America was made out of wood from a ghost ship, the HMS Resolute, which had drifted 1,200 miles since being abandoned 16 months earlier during a search for a scientific expedition which had itself vanished to a man. When compared to other ghost ships, the Mary Celeste isn't even that impressive. Some ghost ships have drifted for as long as 2 years entirely unmanned, such as the MV Alta, which was found in 2020, while another, the SV-21 Friends, was sighted on both sides of the Atlantic during its 2-year solo voyage. A lifeboat of the SS Valencia was found still afloat 27 years after the ship sank, which is nothing next to the SS Beishimo, which spent 38 years at sea without a crew. At the other end of the spectrum, the SV Resolven ship's log showed that whatever had happened to the crew was less than 6 hours old at the time her rescuers found her abandoned. And yet it is the Mary Celeste that has remained in the public consciousness for a century and a half, while all the ones before and after have faded, despite their own, sometimes larger, mysteries. The reason why is simple: the Mary Celeste had good press. Under maritime law, the crew of the DEWA could expect a substantial share of the value of the vessel and cargo they had salvaged, but the court hearing didn't go as planned. This hearing was conducted by Frederick Solly Flood, described by historians as a man whose arrogance and pomposity were inversely proportional to his IQ, and as the sort of man who, once he had made up his mind about something, couldn't be shifted. A contemporary of his considered him an individual of very vivid imagination, and to have survived to some extent at least the judicious application of his mental faculty. Flood was convinced a crime had been committed, and that traces found on the captain's sword were bloodshed during some kind of drunken uprising. And just like that, the crew of the DEWA went from expecting a huge cash prize to being murder suspects. The fact that the traces on the sword proved to be rust and definitely not blood, and that alcohol on board hadn't been drinkable were, much like the Mary Celeste crew, neither here nor there. After several months of fruitless investigation, however, Flood was forced to accept the crew's narrative, but the accusations left a mark, and the DEWA crew's salvage prize was eventually put at £1,700, less than half of what it otherwise would have been. These accusations against the original crew and salvagers are what really brought the story into the public eye, but probably the biggest single reason you know this story is because the creator of Sherlock Holmes, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, then a 25-year-old ship's surgeon, had his first big success with a story about it. But the key word here is story. J. Habakkuk Jeffson's statement takes place on the Mary Celeste, but a year earlier, in 1873, on a trip from Boston to Lisbon instead of New York to Genoa. It also adds passengers, including the eponymous J. Habakkuk Jeffson, to the crew, replaces the captain's oldest child with his youngest, changes the names of the crew but not those of the DEWA, and says the ship is found in almost perfect shape, being watertight, and with all its now multiple lifeboats. Conan Doyle didn't even spell the ship's name right, resulting in the Mary Celeste spelling which persists to this day. But if you're still wondering what solution the creator of Sherlock Holmes came up with, it involves every character who isn't entirely white or dead when the ship sets sail, committing mutiny and murder for a magical talisman. It's maybe not Doyle's most timeless story. At the time though, it was incredibly popular, and as it was the first published anonymously and framed as an eyewitness account, it was assumed by many to be true, much to its own author's surprise. Some newspapers, like the Boston Herald, even reprinted it, thinking it was a factual report, and the man who was so closely involved with the original trial himself, our dear friend, conspiracy theorist, and my feelings don't care about your facts man, Frederick Solly Flood, felt the need to compile his own version of events because of it, and send telegrams to newspapers all over England to denounce the piece of fiction as a fabrication from beginning to end. But despite all this, the floodgates were open, the bilge was filling up, and many other fictional or incorrect retellings of the story cemented it crookedly in the public's imagination, adding such details as a meal being left uneaten on a table. But what happened to her crew? No one knows. Though theories abound, many of them building off the original investigation's ideas of mutiny or foul play from the Celeste or Delgratia's crew. Of course, the most likely suspect remains either a giant octopus or aliens, as both species have a far better documented weird activities than the legendary Homo sapiens sapiens. I mean, just look at that. Terrifying. More likely though, the ship was evacuated due to either an incorrect sounding rod suggesting the ship was taking on water fast, there was about 3.5 feet of water in the hold and a makeshift sounding rod was found abandoned on the deck, or a spectacular but harmless gas explosion caused by alcohol evaporating in the cargo hold and igniting with the friction of the barrels. This would explain the open hatches, and the sudden, though temporary fireball would definitely have been enough to lead to a hasty evacuation, with an unsecure line between the ship and the boat ultimately spelling disaster for the crew sheltering in the latter when the wind picked up. But there is a far larger mystery surrounding the Mary Celeste. In his short story, Conan Doyle's protagonist wonders, is this ship accursed? Was there ever a voyage which began so fairly and which changed so disastrously? If that's enough to diagnose a curse, then the real Mary Celeste was the real-life equivalent of the Event Horizon, a ship escaped from hell itself. You see, the voyage of the ghost ship was just the middle chapter of the story, the Empire Strikes Back of the trilogy. It might be the one that everyone knows best, but around it there is a larger story, one which contains scandal without rumour, a curse without disappearance, and death without innuendo. Innuendo. These other events are less flashy than a mystery that started and ended in a matter of weeks. They have consequently been told fewer times, and there are big gaps in the narrative, but however patchy they may be, they form the much larger tale of a curse. That is the true story of the Mary Celeste. That's one hell of an introduction. Briggs, her captain at the time of his disappearance, was a competent seaman, who came from a long line of respected sailors, many of whom had been lost at sea, some in similarly bizarre mishaps. In fact, while his own disappearance was being investigated in Gibraltar, his brother Oliver, who had invested in a new command, the Julia A. Halleck, at the same time as him, went down with his ship during a storm in the Bay of Biscay. There was only one survivor. Before these trips, the two brothers had discussed giving up captaining once and for all. Two real-life victims of the old "just a few more weeks from retirement" cliché. But at worst, their curse was to get entwined with that of the Mary Celeste. Right from the beginning, the ship seemed unlucky. Her first captain, Captain Robert McClellan, back when she was named the Amazon, didn't even survive her maiden voyage. He fell ill supervising the ship's loading in June 1861 and was dead before the month was out. Under a new captain, the ship collided with fishing equipment in the Narrows off Eastport and ran into and sank a brig in the English Channel. This was all still on her first round trip, by the way. When she was renamed the Mary Celeste in December 1868, she had already been a derelict once, driven ashore in a storm in October 1867 at Cape Breton Island, and Richard W. Haynes, the owner and captain who bought the wreck and gave it the new name, was bankrupted less than a year after doing so. His creditors sold the ship to a consortium who less than 4 years later had the little ghost ship incident so well known of the Mary Celeste. After it was discovered adrift, all crew lost, the Mary Celeste rotted in a harbour for months before the consortium were finally able to get rid of it at a considerable loss. Her new owners might have done better to heed the competition's wariness. The Mary Celeste's journeys in the West Indian and Indian Ocean lost her new owners £5,000, then a considerable amount. I mean, now that's a considerable amount. In less than 2 years, and in February 1879, the ship's captain, Edgar Tuthill, fell ill on board. He was taken to the island of St Helena for medical attention, but it wasn't enough and the ship claimed her third prematurely dead captain. The ship was sold off a year later. At this point, the rumours of a curse were really swirling. Sailors would refuse to serve on her, and it is said one man interested in buying an apparently cheap freighter ran screaming from a New York ship dock when he saw the name on her stern. The Mary Celeste's next captain, Thomas L. Fleming, was obviously made of sterner stuff. That pun. This must have paid off because he lasted 4 years in his post without dying once. However, the ship's business ventures went no better under him than before, and Gilman C. Parker took over the Mary Celeste in August 1884 as her next and last captain. Like Fleming, he wasn't able to keep her, at least financially, afloat, and then things got worse. On January 3rd, 1885, only 5 months into Parker's new command, the Mary Celeste crashed into a reef between Gonave Island and mainland Haiti, ripping out her bottom and wrecking her beyond repair. The entire crew made it ashore in one of the Mary Celeste's more successful lifeboat outings, and Captain Parker sold the salvageable cargo for $500 to the American consul. This was the third time the ship had been salvaged in less than 25 years of existence. However, the ship's bad history in financial matters and in court reared its head one last time when the consul reported that what he had bought was almost worthless. On opening one box shipped as $1,000 worth of cutlery, the insurance investigator found $50 worth of dog collars. Other boxes were worth even less, containing shoddy rubber, rotten fish, melted fat and watered down ale. Parker, in a desperate, ill-conceived and immoral bid to wring some money from the apparently cursed ship, had filled the Mary Celeste with a largely worthless cargo. He'd then misrepresented it on the ship's manifest as valuable goods, overinsured it to the tune of what would now be $850,000, and then intentionally crashed the ship on the well-known reef. Yet again, the Mary Celeste was in court over a substantial but ultimately ephemeral payout. Parker should have remembered how well previous court cases had gone for people who had stepped on board the Mary Celeste. In fact, her bad history was so extensive that most newspapers reporting on the latest court case barely thought it worth mentioning that she had once been found missing her entire crew, if they mentioned it at all. Parker and his co-conspirators were tried in Boston in July of 1885, with Parker facing a possible death sentence. However, a deal was struck and all the conspirators left free, minus all the money they had previously received, and, of course, their reputations. But even this was only a temporary reprieve. Parker died in poverty just 3 months later, one of his co-defendants went mad and another killed himself. Paul Begg, author of Mary Celeste, The Greatest Mystery of the Sea, wrote that, "If the court of man could not punish these 3 men, the curse that had devilled the ship since her first skipper, Robert McClellan, had died on her maiden voyage, could reach beyond the vessel's watery grave and exact its own terrible retribution. The ship, it seems, has now been absorbed into the coral reef that sank her. Presumably her curse, if cursed she was, took its last victim with these men. Her bizarre run of bad luck, financial ruin and death had ended. Ghost ships happen. They're rare, but they happen. What are the odds of all these things happening to one of those ghost ships? What caused the death of Benjamin Briggs, her second serving captain? We may never know for sure. We have more direct information on the fates of the other 3, Robert McClellan, Edgar Tuthill, and Gilman C. Parker. But do we know what really killed them? Not to mention Briggs's crew and brother, Parker's colleagues and people who went down with the Julia A. Halleck. Are all these events just coincidences? The kind of thing that could happen to any ship with less than 3 decades of history, whose entire crew vanished once? We'll let you decide. I hope you enjoyed that episode of Spooky History. You can find us on most social media at Spookiest Show, and you can support us with donations at paypal.me/noisyghostend. If you liked that and want to also know about the undead types of ghost ships, the spooky spectral ones, then let us know in the comments. Thanks for watching, and please, do have nightmares. Goodbye.